It's such a warm welcome to everyone, and welcome to Melbourne, welcome to RMIT. We're really excited to have everyone here, and we expect today's conference, symposium is going to be exciting. We've got a wonderful lineup of people today, and we're going to talk about transnational mobility, friends, family, Facebook, a little bit about the FFF. I just really wanted the FFF at the end because it just sounded so cute, but it's about technology, it's about communication, it's about connectivity, and it's about everyday life, because everyday life is about transience, it's about transnationalism, it's about migration, it's about technology, it's about communication, it's about even not being connected to wherever or whoever we want to. It's about families, it's about friends. And this is something we're going to talk about a lot today, and and we're all hoping that you'll be very much engaged in that. Now, part of this is also I have to thank the RMIT Foundation, because without them we wouldn't be able to bring a wonderful keynote, who all of us I think at some stage in the last few years have actually read the work of Professor Brenda Yeoh. And it's a little bit of a plug also for the Digital Ethnographic Research Center, DERC. And we've just actually opened a new research lab, and it's called Migration and Digital Mobility. Migration and Digital Media. Brain not quite working properly. And a number of, in fact, everyone who is part of that group is actually speaking today. So we're really, really happy to have that going. Now, because this is a free symposium, and as many people know, funding is always difficult. So please forgive us that we have a light lunch, but it's not a big lunch. We have break time, but we can give you sunshine. But this place is actually nicely located next to a cafe. And there's also a lot of food everywhere. So if you want to go off during the break time or lunchtime to get something more substantial, please come up straight away, because then we can eat together, laugh and cry and stuff. The program today, we've kind of printed the programs for you. I've realized too that having too long a day can be a bit tiring. So at the end of the day, when we have our roundup, it will then be followed by the launch of a journal that we've just started. It's called Transitions, and a number of the authors are actually here. So we're sort of transitioning into that, and I promise you we won't keep you for too long. We're just a bit proud of our little baby. And other than that, thank you so much for coming, and I think we're going to have a wonderful time talking about issues that all of us are really interested in, and issues that are going to be part of everyone's future later on. We are also really, really, really lucky today to have one of the most well-known migration and mobility experts, not just in the Asia-Pacific, but in the world. Professor Brenda Yeoh from the National University of Singapore is not only Dean of Arts and Social Sciences, but more importantly, and this is why we absolutely adore her work, she is also the research leader of the migration cluster at the Asian Research Institute. And quite a few people who have worked there, who have presented there, are also here today. So it's a kind of gathering of friends as well. And Brenda's work, I'm not going to say much about it, because I think she's going to, she's the best person to explore that. She's going to talk about families, which is, and the other day we were talking about this, that families are very global, because at some stage, your children are overseas studying. At some stage, your parents are overseas for one reason or the other. Your home becomes a global space as well. In places like Singapore and Hong Kong and Malaysia, you have foreign domestic workers coming in. So that global space is actually really very much part of everyday life. And this is something we're going to explore. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Professor Brenda Yeoh.
Is this this is working, right? Please forgive the part about the dean. I know deans are not usually liked, and I have the pleasure to tell you that there's a dean search going on right now in Singapore, and I should be stepping down soon. So, in terms of this particular conference, I'm in a sense very taken by the 3 Fs. Family, friends, and Facebook. I'm just in a sense, I would have expected Kat actually to put in 4th or 5th F actually. I would have thought she would have put furry folks, as part of the title as well, given her love for animals, a love for animals that I share as well. So
Next conference, Brenda.
Next conference, okay, it'll be family, friends, and Facebook, and furry folks. Yes. So so for this particular talk that I would like to share, it draws actually on work that I do in collaboration with quite a number of people, some of whom are in the room, and or would be in Melbourne somewhere. So in that sense, this is also a collaborative kind of effort across many dimensions. So I've decided to focus on transnational families, and particularly the negotiation of temporal orderings, looking at simultaneities, rhythms, and ruptures. The communications technologies bit I put in because I knew the kind of crowd I'll be facing, but actually I know very little about communications technology, and I'm here to learn a bit more about that aspect of transnationalism. So this is not the clicker. This is some contraption. So yeah, how do I move the slides?
You will handle it.
Just tell me when.
Oh, okay. So is there okay. Do you want to give me the keyboard, or is that? No clicker. Okay, so right. Okay, so I will point. Okay, so first I would like to start with some discussion on conceptualizations that is in the literature. So if we could the next slide. Okay, so as we all know, conceptualizations of the nation state and the family household, and of course there's a differentiation in terms of those terminologies. In the more traditional kind of migration scholarship, draws on concepts of the nation state, concepts of the family and the household as taken for granted social formations with fairly clearly defined, unambiguously defined kind of membership and clearly defined boundaries. But of course, this has changed greatly, and if you look at the way that family life is lived in Asia these days, that's a world of a difference, although the ideological kind of intent of families in Asia still continues to hold in terms of the fact that families are often conceived of as the so-called building block of the nation. So because it's imagined in such a way, it is seen as a vital component that's folded into and constituent of the nation state. And precisely for those kinds of reasons, it becomes a prime site for social policy intervention, given this sense that it's foundational to the nation state. And of course, that throws up all kinds of issues and problems. As I was trying to say, this kind of a way of approaching families and the nation state was to change significantly in the literature, at least, with the advent of the transnationalism kind of optic. From the 1990s, and more recently, and the mobilities paradigm again has troubled the kinds of foundations, families as a foundation stone to nation state kind of approach. So these kinds of taken for granted objects of study, the family, the household, have to be rethought in terms of new spatialities and new temporalities. As these borders, the border crossings become a lot more frequent these days, and borders become transgressed, become rigidified sometimes, and redrawn in the face of these multiple mobilities that we all experience. So, and I think most people in the room would be familiar with the recent sort of, well, not so recent now, more like in the last couple of decades, the notion of transnational families becoming something more commonly accepted, no longer seen to be oxymoronic, because in fact the scalar relationship between family and nation state is now reversible. It's not necessarily the case that the family is nested within the nation state, as you see in this, how do I, okay, okay. As you see in this particular picture, the nation state can now be folded into the family household, as this particular Straits Times article says. It says she's like family. This is an Indonesian domestic worker who is working in the household of this elderly gentleman, 73 years old, I think, and this picture is supposed to show how he's given up his bedroom for her, his carer, and to illustrate the fact that she's treated like family. Of course, we must in a sense take this all with a pinch of salt, but it says there in the sort of, what do you call that, the caption that she has time to rest and watch TV as well. So she's like family. So in that sense, the family in Singapore now, in a sense, comprises people from harking from different nation states coming together in the work of care, and that in a sense constitutes what might seem like family. Okay, and again, the ideology of family, of course, has many other issues to do with it. So the flip side then is that families can also now be stretched across national borders, right? So, and that's the flip side of the coin, as you see in this particular picture that shows this is the work of someone called John Clang, who basically work on putting together disparate pictures of family members in different parts of the world together in one shot in order to constitute, in order to imagine family life. And as you can see in this particular photograph, the furry creatures are also there, right, as part of the family. Maybe the next slide would be a bit clearer. Here is John Clang himself in this Be Here Now project, collection of images picturing groups or relatives, family members originally from Singapore, included in one shot. So that's him, his parents and brother, as well as his wife, who's in a different part of the States. He's in New York, the family's in Singapore. His wife is somewhere else in the US, in that little shot there. So this is, I suppose, one of many ways in which people who are flung across the world imagine themselves as family. So there is this shared imaginary of belonging that familial relations are built upon, and which are negotiated across transnational borders via communication technologies. Okay, so border crossings today then is very deeply embedded in the global and local kind of politics, power politics, and that's not just tied to transnational capital and transnational labor, but it's of course negotiated at the scale of everyday family life and gender identities, which is something that I'm kind of interested in. So in response to these kinds of developments, migration scholars have developed theoretical kind of concepts to try to capture the essence of change. And I think we're all familiar with transnational families, which are defined by families across national borders, but who continue to share strong bonds of collective welfare and unity. But maybe a little less familiar with the idea of global householding, which I find quite useful as well. This emphasizes the view that the formation and sustenance of households is increasingly reliant on the international movement of people and transactions among household members residing across borders in different national territories. So the idea that to constitute a household requires the household to draw on the resources from across the national borders. This is a concept, the next slide, that harks back to one of my RE colleagues, Michael Douglas' work. I mean, he formulated this idea of global householding to try to, in a sense, show the link between migration, household reproduction, and the reproduction of societies in an age of globalization. So this is exemplified in Asia by the very rapid rise we see of the employment of non-familial migrant domestic workers, like the Indonesian domestic worker that you saw earlier on, as sort of part of family, right? The increasing rate of international and cross-border marriages. This was a talk that I gave yesterday, again to do with the recruiting of foreign brides into the family for working class men in Singapore. And of course, we also know of other aspects of global householding involving children, like raising and educating children abroad. I mean, this is something very commonly seen in this part of the world. I mean, I see on the streets, I mean, many university students who basically are also probably part of step migration for many families as well. And of course, we all know this, frequent flyer kind of lifestyles these days, border crossings that link the productive and the reproductive aspects of family activities. Okay, and so let me now pause a little bit on global householding and to look at the outsourcing of care work within the family to non-familial others. This is something that is quite common in global cities like Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and increasingly, I'm told, in even the more rapidly developing parts of China. They are also recruiting sort of domestic workers to shore up the care deficit within homes. So these Southeast Asian women from the less developed economies in the region are recruited at low cost by socially and economically privileged Singaporean women, for example, who trade in their class privileges for freedom from the burden of household reproductive labor. I put partial there because even if you have, in a sense, downloaded the sort of more physical kind of work of holding up the family, it's partial because women don't normally sort of escape completely from the household reproductive labor. So this is this kind of aspect of global householding is compounded by state policies that in places like Singapore, Taiwan, and so forth, which treat migrant domestic workers as transient labor with fairly diminished employment rights. And so we see the gender politics of the home being negotiated between local and foreign women vis-a-vis racialized grid of highly asymmetrical kind of power relations, while of course most of the men continue to abdicate household responsibilities, and this is quite common in Asia. So Emiko Ochai, a Japanese academic, coined this phrase called liberal familialism, which refers to the cost of purchasing care labor, which is borne by the family, but where the family activities such as filial piety is outsourced to others whose services are bought and then brought across international borders. So here we see a foreign domestic worker, I think she's Indonesian, watching a television drama with her elderly Singaporean Chinese employer. The likelihood is they are watching Korean drama. I mean, that's, and the interesting thing for me is that they all speak different languages. The Indonesian domestic worker probably speaks Indonesian. The Chinese Singaporean employer probably speaks either dialect or Mandarin. And of course, they're enjoying Korean drama. So, I mean, so this is maybe multilingualism in its sort of one of the aspirational kind of multilingualism. So, and this is becoming a lot more common whilst her children, the children as opposed to, in a sense, perform filial piety, are out building their careers or hard at work to shore up the productive aspects of being family. So, and of course, this would have been seen by some, but Kat says to show the trailer because it's not something that all have seen. This is Ilo Ilo, our very first award-winning film by Anthony Chen, and it's about the foreign domestic worker who looks after an 8-year-old boy in a Singapore home. The title Iloilo is the name of a province in the Philippines, but the Chinese title is a lot more, I think, instructive. It says Pama Pu Zai Jia, which means father and mother not at home. So this is where the the domestic worker steps in. So this is just a trailer. You want to watch the movie? Yeah, it's just a minute or two.
You can call me Terry, Mom. This is your bed. Sleep here. Huh? Terry, give me your passport.
干嘛拿人家 passport 啊？
把他突然跑掉了。
You can see 啊。喂，哎，
做什么你？你干嘛工？I am your maid, but I didn't come here to be bullied. Enough. Go and do your work, don't be careful. Jalan. Your hair very tall. I help you wash your hair. Oi, Jalan, stop. Mami, 给 Auntie Terry 站这边。Teresa, I'm his mother, not you.
How long have you been out of job for?
2 months. Henry，
Yes.
你当妈妈，你整天就会看穿你老公啊？
你不可以脚踏实地一点，安分守己一点。
可是我已经没有。
现在什么局势，做什么生意，
难道你就
可以不要
不能让我
讲了吗？
老王，妈咪有话要跟你说。
你个妹，你干什么？
Right, so this is based on Anthony Chen's own sort of life experience growing up with a domestic worker. And essentially the story ends with Terry, Auntie Terry having to go home because his parents were retrenched during the 1997-98 financial crisis. So in that sense, the fates and fortunes of individuals that from different nation states are wound together in many ways these days as a result of, in this case, economic globalization coming to a halt. So yeah, so that's in a sense to illustrate sort of global householding involving foreign domestic workers. Another form of global householding takes the form of cross-border marriages, and I gave a talk on this yesterday, so I won't be too long on this. But to say that analogous to the practice of middle-class families recruiting migrant domestic workers for householding purposes, working-class families who cannot afford a domestic worker will then draw on recruiting foreign brides, basically, as sort of unpaid care labor. So in Singapore, with globalization and expanding kind of educational and career opportunities for women, so in that sense, Singapore women are now, in a sense, very much part of the workforce, building careers and so forth, which leaves a care deficit within the home, and which accounts for the domestic workers. But there's another issue related to that, which is that Singapore men from the lower socio-economic strata, working class men basically, feel sort of positionally left behind by local women's participation in the workforce. And they find that they have little luck in the marriage market because these women are seen to be too career-minded, too financially independent to want to marry them. So in Singapore, there's a growing, well, I mean, we have delayed marriages, non-marriages, and declining sort of marriage rates, and that's partly because the university-educated women who are not getting married, I mean, they don't need to get married. I mean, they are financially independent. And the working class men don't marry each other. So there's a marry up, marry down kind of phenomenon. So that means that for these working class men, they would go to, okay, thank you. They will look to the region, to the less developed countries in the region for a source of rights, because this is where they also hope to find those women who are considered more traditional, willing to take on procreation and caring roles, like staying home and giving birth to children and things that perhaps Singaporean career-minded women are no longer willing to do, so to sustain the household. So this is another aspect of global householding. So in Asian cities like Singapore, there has been an increase in international marriage rates that then introduces diversity into the primary relations that constitute the family. So in Singapore, for example, cross-nationality marriages involving a citizen spouse and a foreign spouse now accounts for about a third of all marriages registered in Singapore. So this is not a small phenomenon, this is a growing phenomenon. So this is like a marriage agency, a matchmaking international marriage agency, and called for largely Vietnamese women to Singaporean Chinese men. So as you can see, it says here that the tagline is that in both Chinese and English is that a Vietnam wife is keen to do household chores and is willing to take care of parents wholeheartedly. So the kinds of work that perhaps Singaporean women are less willing to do. So this other poster basically shows sort of the increase in more mixed unions, both at the elite level, but also increasingly at among working class men. So this is yet another, this is a sort of a smiling couple, child being born to this mixed marriage couple. So, and of course I can go on, I mean, to look at adoption of children and so forth, but I haven't done work in those aspects, so I'll let you sort of think about other aspects of global householding. Let's then move on to look quickly at the idea of transnational family, which I believe is more sort of well understood. This of course stems from Bryson's and Varela's pioneering work on transnationally split family members, maintaining this sense of collective welfare and unity, this idea of familyhood across national borders. And in their book, they talk about two sets of strategies, and I think these are very useful to rethink and develop further. One is frontiering, which denotes ways and means that transnational family members use to create familial space and network ties in terrain where affinal kind of connections are relatively sparse. And secondly, the idea of relativizing, referring to the way that individual family members establish, maintain, and sometimes curtail relational ties with specific family members. So it's not just a question of living together in a hunky-dory fashion, but of course there's also the sense that you relativize certain relationships and push away certain relationships more so than others. So this gives us a way of conceptualizing families that is, in a sense, akin to imagine transnational communities where membership is a matter not so much of blood ties, but a matter of choice and negotiation. So members can choose to maintain both emotional and material attachments of varying degrees of intensity with certain family members, whilst opting out of transnational relations with others. And because these relationships are transnationalized across space, that in a sense increases the power of this kind of relativizing, right? So, I mean, you may not like a particular sibling or other, but you can't ignore the person if the person is living under the same roof, right? But if the person is far, far away, then the work of relativizing becomes, I think, more acute. So in the Asian context, and here I'm going to draw on work of different kinds of groups of people, the geographically dispersed kind of transnational family that is stretched, that's remolded by migration as a new form of living arrangements, is now quite common across a very broad spectrum of society. So it's not just confined to elite families. It is something that's undertaken by a very broad swathe of different families in different socio-economic formations. So at the elite end, of course, we know of the Asian astronaut families where the wife will remain with the children in the host country, like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, I think, as well, whilst the so-called astronaut husband will commute between host and home countries, largely to do work in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And of course, astronaut families are also accompanied by what's been called the parachute kids phenomenon. Okay, I won't pause too much on this except to maybe point you to this this drawing by a friend when we were doing this project on families, and she asked her 4.5-year-old daughter to draw the family, right? I mean, and as usual, you have the flowers, the rainbow, and so forth. And the child drew herself, mom carrying baby brother. So that's baby brother there. And then when asked, where's father? Where's dad? So she pointed to the aeroplane in the sky, because dad's always in the air commuting, shuttling from place to place. So from Lynn's imagination, that's where, in a sense, dad is in. So that illustrates the kind of frequent flyer families that occupy the elite strata. Okay, I better go on a bit faster. So for at the other end of the spectrum, temporary contract workers, particularly those considered unskilled or performing 3D work, many of them are locked into a rotating door kind of regime that enforces transience. So in this case, transience is not by choice, it is a necessity. So these kinds of families that are split will depend on transnational networks, remittance flows, circuits of care and affection to connect dispersed members and to enact family across borders. Okay, so I'm going on to a second section of the paper, basically to look at the politics and practices of transnational and Asian families, and I'll try to be as quick as possible. Here, in terms of the first of all, in terms of ideologies and identities, I mean, this is, of course, an important theme in transnational family literature, because families that are transnational draw on ideologically laden kind of imaginaries to give coherence to the notion of belonging together despite the physical dispersal of their family members. And in Asia, Iwa Ong has talked about how the family is a primary unit of regulation and the vehicle of state power. And these kinds of imaginaries often act as a conservative force that exerts control over particularly female members, even as we see in the region the feminization and labor migration opening up more sort of emancipatory kind of possibilities. So as domestic workers migrate to become sometimes the main breadwinners of the families, there are also other forces at work which conserve the traditional family form. We see this in Rachel Sylvie's work, where she discusses the Indonesian state's construction of the family as a bulwark against the social cost of modernity, and where women become the linchpin that's responsible for the fate of the family. So in this context, even as these migrant women leave their families to work abroad as domestic workers, care workers, and so forth, they are simultaneously exalted both as heroes of foreign exchange, a phrase often used, whilst at the same time seen to be in need of protection to preserve their sexual and moral purity for the sake of their families. So this kind of double-edged discourse pervades much of state policy. So at the same time, I mean, the continuing sort of overseas labor migration and the income that these women bring in, the remittances basically, are seen to be important to sustain visions of the newly emerging bourgeoisie consumerist family in Indonesia. So, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Rachel's work, but her work basically illustrates that particular aspect of, of transnational families. So, so transnational families negotiate care and intimacy across borders with both the distant and proximate members. And in this process, social identities, including gender identities, may be reinforced or reconfigured. So there's no sort of automatic kind of equation of migrant women finding liberation from gender identities. I mean, I think we need to look more closely at the politics at play. So the feminization of transnational labor migration in Southeast Asia has impacted the changing arrangements of care for particularly left behind children. They are growing up in many parts of developing Asia in the physical absence of migrant mothers and under the care of either the father or other surrogate caregivers. And this is work that we've done in Singapore under the CHAMSI project, which compels us to rethink gender identities in the social provisioning of everyday and generational care. So we see here the work that we've been doing, in a sense, partly points to the durability of the woman carer model and mothering identities, where these kinds of gender ideals that surround motherhood tends to be very resilient, even in the context of transnational migration. So mothering at a distance reconstitutes good mothering to incorporate breadwinning, and this often continues maternal responsibility for nurturing the family using telecommunications in order to demonstrate affection and so forth. And that's very much part of Paranas's seminal work. So the care vacuum that results from the absence of these migrant mothers is filled by other female relatives like grandmothers and aunts that take on the mother's role in the caring work, and this then upholds normative kind of gender behavior and the conventional gender division of labor. So the cartoon that says, if a woman wishes for no housework, no cooking, no cleaning, then the only solution is to become a man, right? So although in Singapore there is an alternative to the man, which is, of course, the domestic worker. So there's another different kind of gender politics at work. But going on to the story of what's happening in the countries where the children are left behind, then part of CHAMSI work, and this is work done with Lan, who's in Melbourne somewhere and maybe coming at some point. The work looking at which calls into question this idea, this very commonly held view that is women doing all the work and that the left behind husband is a delinquent who refuses to readjust to the family's changing roles in the absence of his wife. So we didn't find that, so this is not so much to redeem the men, but we found a much more complex kind of scenario in amongst the left behind communities in Southeast Asia. We found that the men tend to struggle to live up to highly moralistic kind of masculine ideals of being both good fathers and independent breadwinners, and they would take on some sorts of the care functions, and many would claim that they are the primary caregivers for the left behind children, but at the same time they will perform care differently. So one of the differences would be that left behind children are cared for by fathers not on a full-time basis. Most of the fathers will continue to hang on to some kind of paid work, even if the monetary returns are very low. So the wife is now the main breadwinner. The husband is left behind looking after the children, but husbands would still continue to strive for some semblance of economic autonomy and repackage fathering identities. So that's, to us, an interesting kind of aspect of what's happening in the source communities. So in as much as the Asian transnational family is shaped by and struggles against this ideological infrastructure of patriarchal kind of norms, we also want to point out that it's not just to do with ideologies, it's also families also lived on an everyday basis through negotiating webs of relationships and developing intimacies across borders. So another aspect of the work on Asian transnational families focuses on doing families. So the aspects to do with how people basically go through everyday life in the practice of being family. So, and this of course draws on work on transnational circuits of affection, care, and financial support. This particular poster is actually one by an NGO group for negotiating for a day off for the domestic worker, on the basis that, as it says here, she's not just your maid. Her name is Lita. She works for your family, but she also has a family of her own. So this idea that these domestic workers are also actively involved in doing family across borders, their own family, not just being a member of the global household. So I think I will skip this, except the last point, which in a sense, of course, with transnational communications, there's now many ways of mothering from across the distance. And at the same time, transnational communications may be very uneven. So in the good old days, letters may not arrive, but of course, phones could also be switched off. And in the CHAMSI work that we did find some women not being able to be in touch with their families because they live in households where the phone is not something that they have access to during the work day. So this could be deliberate rupture as well in the case of family members who want to, in a sense, withdraw from a distance as well. So in a sense, communication technologies are very important in the work of relativizing and doing family. So just to sum up, the changing technologies, the economic costs and emotional pains and gains of staying connected in order to do family across national borders are quite central to understanding the inner workings of the transnational family. The third and last aspect I want to talk about in terms of transnational families has to do with strategic intent, because families assume this kind of transnational morphology often with the strategic goal or strategic intent of ensuring either economic survival or maximizing social mobility. So it's been said in the literature that for low-income transnational families, going transnational is a way of a new family form that's born out of the inequalities in the global economy today, and is reproduced by means of dependence on the transnational division of labor. So to illustrate that, I mean, a couple of examples. So for example, transnationalizing the family may be a strategic move undertaken to accomplish specific projects around children's education. So middle-class families, for example, would provide an overseas education for their children, and that is a class move to acquire symbolic capital with international value, and therefore, in a sense, try to reproduce and upgrade the social status and mobility of the family. And that's very pertinent in Johanna Waters' work. In the work that we've done in Singapore on study mothers, the Peitu Mama, basically we see these Chinese study mothers inserting themselves and their children into Singapore's educational landscape against quite major odds in order to invest in their children's education as a main route of international social mobility and prestige. So getting out of China and enrolling themselves into an English based educational system becomes a way of gaining social mobility for the family. Finally, I want to say a little bit more about the temporal orderings of transnational families. Okay, so I've just, in a sense, much of the literature focuses on migrants crossing spatial borders. The whole idea about transnational families is about crossing spatial borders. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that borders may be as much temporal as spatial, and that the demarcating of then and now is as important as the here and there. And this can, to quote from Shanti Robertson's work, can take the shape of actual physical borders, paper borders, imagined borders of identity and belonging. So the transnational family is, yes, it's about living across spatially inscribed borders, but it's also shaped by the structuring of time within prevailing migration regimes. And so this focus on time is, I think, something that scholars of the transnational family ought to take more account of. A temporal approach will alert us to the fact that time often functions differentially as a border, and as Shanti's work shows, processing time, pathways to permanence may be accelerated for elite, skilled or business migrants, and she's talking about the context of Australia, and because these are seen to be more desirable under the migration regime here, whilst unskilled labor is often kept temporary and precarious. So in Asia too, we have new modes of temporariness being instituted in new ways that's driven by all kinds of neoliberal forces, like the just-in-time process of importing flexible, transient and expendable labor. So in terms of migration governance and border regulation, time can be mobilized as a form of discipline and control, which in turn then structures family life for the migrant. So as this particular quote says, being temporary is a mode of governmental disciplining power that affects migrants' everyday lives, their labor market opportunities, as well as their interactions with their families. So another work that I like very much is Garcia Mascarenhas's work on migrants and the confined and legality, where she talks about how the different sort of spatial and temporal disciplinary strategies of the state. That's first of all spatial in terms of policing territorial borders, but also temporal because the state also controls the temporal presence of the migrant, leading to legal migrants who can be overnight transformed into illegal overstayers once the contracts or the visa expires. And of course also by limiting human rights to discourage belonging and to, in a sense, define workers, immobilize them and define workers as temporary and therefore deportable subjects. So applying some of that to the case of Singapore and foreign domestic workers working in this regime of what's been called permanent temporariness. Here in Singapore, the domestic workers come in on a highly managed system of 2-year work permits, which allow for easy repatriation, and they are admitted into the nation state as disposable labor with no pathway to permanent residency at all. And of course, subject to quite draconian kind of measures that circumscribe family formation and which closes off the possibility of sinking roots into Singapore society. Say they cannot bring dependents, they are prohibited from marrying Singapore citizens and PRs, and they can be repatriated if found pregnant. So this basically circumscribes family formation. So family life for migrant domestic workers is then also strongly conditioned by the rhythms that are dictated by work contracts and employment conditions. So the daily and weekly rhythms of family life will be shaped by, as I mentioned before, the uneven access to communications technologies, the phone, the web cameras, online communities, and so forth. For some, it's freely available. Others, it could be much more restricted. The rhythm of family life is also dictated by the contract, and that becomes a very important aspect of domestic workers' life, because home visits can only be timed in between the 2-year contracts. So as Veena says here, I'm happy to see my family on Skype. Okay, this is to do with the kinds of ICTs that she uses and have access to. Once every 1 or 2 months is okay. I see how my son, so that my son doesn't forget my face, but it takes so much effort, not only on my side, but on their side. Imagine we have to arrange for a specific time to meet because they have to go to the computer shop and to the relative's house in order to access the internet, and we spend most of our time setting up than talking. So she says that she prefers to call on the cell phone as opposed to using Skype because that's more accessible and more convenient. So there's also an uneven sort of distribution of ICTs amongst low income, low domestic workers. So how temporalities are experienced is significant in the work of doing transnational families, because families have to try to transcend the temporal lags between here and there. And if they succeed and create synchronous times, then, again to quote from Shanti, they simultaneously create historic trails of the past, synchronize different time zones in the present, and express sort of together imaginaries of the future. But where they fail, that transnational family life may lead to a sense of disjuncture and may unravel or rupture. And another work that we've been drawing on in looking at temporalities is Suina's work, where he notes that migration may be understood as a series of processes marking a transitional stage between different statuses. So this idea of migration as forever temporary, migration as a transitional stage and condition that's suffused with liminalities. And his description of liminalities is, I think, quite evocative. It's often characterized by indecision, confusion, incompleteness, underachievement, eternal expectation. Not many of the things that we feel sometimes. These are some of the emotions and mental states that accompany liminal times of migration. The future is uncertain, the present seems to be leading nowhere, and the past cannot be relied upon as a guide for action. Rather dismal, but this describes the kind of liminal times that migrants sometimes have to live within. I'm not going to have time to go through examples which are drawn from a paper that has been published in Social Cultural Geographies that Maria sitting there is also an author on. But just to say that in there are examples of domestic workers and their sense of liminality, as well as, so maybe I'll skip this. Well, in this case, just to say that in Malati's case, liminality was strongest when she felt that she was placed outside the usual obligations of social life. Her mothering role had ended, and her son was in a very rebellious teenage stage. So she felt very sort of saddened by that, and instead of seeing migration as an aspiration-filled endeavor, she felt that she was very much bound in a liminal condition of that's characterized by uncertainty, contingency, and in a way that wasn't very promising. So I won't go through her example, but let me get on to maybe a slightly happier story, where first of all, drawing on Suina's work again, where he makes a distinction between what he calls a grey sense of meanwhileness and a vivid sense of simultaneity. Simultaneity is when there's a sense that others, maybe in a different country, are doing at the same time things that are meaningfully related to one's experience. Whereas meanwhileness implies a mere awareness that there are others going about their separate business at the same time as oneself. So he talks about how, in a sense, communication technologies has facilitated this process of resynchronization between migrants and their homeland, and that the mobile phone is, of course, a key aspect of this. And in Singapore, over 90% of the Indonesian domestic workers that we surveyed had a mobile phone. At the same time, it's not always easy to resynchronize your lives in such a way that there's a sense of simultaneity. As again, this particular example show, and I probably don't have time anymore, right? So, So then maybe I'll just quickly go through Yanni's case. So in Yanni's, and this is the last example I'll use, basically in Yanni's case, she was separated from her husband when she was 3 months pregnant. So she had to come to Singapore for the first time in 2001 to seek work as a domestic worker to support herself and her son. So that was her motivating factor for coming to work in Singapore. A decade later, her son's aspiration for higher education was the motivating factor for her to continue to work as a domestic worker in Singapore. So as she says here, so till now I've earned money by myself, built my own 2-story house, got my son to university. When my son was still young, I built my house. Now after that house is finished, I pay his university fees. So in that sense, the motivation was very much rooted in trying to work for her son. So for migrant women whose transnational journeys are driven by aspirational goals of significant left behind members like Yanni's son, she kept saying, I just follow his passion. Her work as time in Singapore is measured against a temporal backdrop back home. So she said that actually she only wanted to work here for 2 years, but as time passed, I realized I need to earn money for my child's education. It is hard to find a job in my village. Who doesn't want to see their children succeed, right? Even though it's hard, even though sometimes my body aches, even though I'm suffering alone, and sometimes I can't sleep, when I'm sick, I have to take care of myself, to eat medicine so that I can get back to work. So that's very clear what her motivating force is. So it's driven by the aspirational goals that has been amplifying from time to time. So Yanni has now spent 13 years in Singapore at the time when she was interviewed. And this 13-year sojourn was only disrupted once in a major way, where she returned home and stayed for a month at the end of her time with her third employer. So the circumstances around her temporary return were largely part and parcel of Singapore's regulatory regime that governed work permit holders, because her passport expired and she was dependent on the employer to renew her passport. So that's one reason why she went back. But at the same time, there was also a typhoon hitting her house in Indonesia, causing the roof to be damaged, and so she was worried about the safety of her family members, so she went home. So whilst these circumstances were coincidental, Yanni's narration of this series of events that temporarily disrupted her sojourn illustrates for us this vivid sense of simultaneity operating in transnational lives. So whatever is happening back home and whatever is happening here are very much conjoined and in this vivid sense of simultaneity. So in that sense, her sojourn in Singapore has led to this spatial and temporal disconnect with what her life might have been if she had stayed on in the village, where everyday life is regulated by a very strong sense of community and the rhythm of life cycle rituals. And she says that if she had lived in Indonesia, I can do community work with my neighbors, but if I stay far from them, now that she's been in Singapore for 13 years, I don't even know who is getting married, who has died, I don't know at all. That is my difficulty. Working in Singapore is an experience and life journey that I'm grateful for, but she has lost a sense of connection with the village and community back home. So to sum up, in Yanni's case, this vivid sense of simultaneity that's linked to her immediate family members is also conjoined to this grey sense of meanwhileness, to use Suina's terms, in relation to the community. So she is very conscious that while she's prepared to pay the price for her journey to Singapore because that facilitated her achievement of family aspirations, she is in a sense not looking forward to return, because return is not likely to be a homecoming to a village that she knows. In fact, return is likely to place her in the liminality of belonging neither here nor there. So in that sense, whilst she is very vividly connected to her family members, there's also this very grey sense of meanwhileness in relation to the larger community. So that's in a sense what I was trying to illustrate, the different ways in which temporal dimensions of migration work in the lives of migrants and their families. This idea that temporal dimensions also need to be looked at because they work in concert with spatial structures and practices in trying to understand and unravel sort of transnational family living. So to sum up, what I was trying to say is that we need to, in a sense, give attention to rhythms, the rhythms of transnational family life that are in part conditioned by temporal orderings integral to the migration regime. So it's very much ordered by the state and the migration regime. And transience in particular is a condition that has far-reaching consequences for doing family across borders. The other two modes of temporality that I wanted to, in a sense, talk about in the summary is the liminal times that can be suffused with ambiguity, and this is often linked to uncertainty and a sense of being placed outside your usual sort of social obligations. It need not necessarily coincide with actual difficult times, but it's often this sense that you're no longer connected to a group that you are, in a sense, invested in. Finally, I was also trying to show the idea of synchronous times, where family life centers on this vivid sense of simultaneity that's built upon collective shared aspirations, collective project making, in struggling against the odds of doing family. Yeah, okay, I think that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
You can sit down. That might be easier. And now, thank you so much, Brenda. And we've got 10 minutes for question and answer, because I think Brenda's given us a lot of things to think about. So who would like to kick off with the first question? Val.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brenda, for a very interesting presentation, as always. I actually have two questions. Is that allowed?
Briefly.
Let's try. Okay, my first question is, earlier in your presentation, you mentioned racialized grid of highly asymmetrical power relations to do with domestic workers, etc. I'm interested in the racialized, if you can expand a little bit on that one. And my second question is simpler, I think. You told us a little bit about the migration regime that exists in Singapore, limiting domestic workers to 2 years, etc. But do Singaporean labor laws protect domestic workers in any substantive way in terms of their wages? Is there a minimum wage, and are they protected from abuse, and etc.? We know horrific stories from the Middle East, for example. So I just wonder how that in Singapore.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'll respond in sort of the other way around. So in terms of domestic workers, there is no minimum wage law in Singapore. So, and in fact, domestic work is not considered under the Employment Act. So unlike other low-skilled workers, like construction workers, shipyard workers, which tend to be largely men, these will be protected under the Employment Act. So there will be, the usual sort of terms of work, how many hours of work, and so forth. Domestic work is not covered under the Employment Act. So in that sense, it's covered by individual contract between the employer and the employee. The embassies as well as NGOs have done quite a bit to try to shape this contract. So like the Philippines government would insist that there is a certain minimum wage that has to be paid for Filipino domestic workers, and so forth. So in that sense, it's not like completely sort of up for grabs, but it's also very much dependent on the negotiations that happen at other levels, impinging on that contract between the employer and the employee. The migration industry, which is an aspect that I have a lot of interest in, basically also plays a role because the migration, the placement agencies also have a role to play in terms of how this particular contract between employer and employee shapes up. In terms of protection under the law, then in that case, domestic workers are covered like everybody else under the various laws. So in fact, the sentence for abuse of a domestic worker is 1.5 times higher than to a citizen. So that was brought in place about 20 years ago because of all the domestic worker abuse. So if abuse is perpetrated to a domestic worker, that entails, so if you're supposed to be jailed for 6 years, then you'll be jailed for 9 years, something like that. Yeah. So, so in Singapore, that was quite easily put in place, but the arguments for minimum wage and all that is much, much harder. Okay, so then the racialized aspects of care labor, I mean, there's of course a very strong gender dimension, which I'm sure you noticed even if I hadn't sort of emphasized that too much. But the racialized aspects of it largely involves the fact that domestic workers are only to be sourced from certain countries. So in that sense, and certain countries would be the Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. I think the newest source is Cambodia. So these women come in to work in households, which are largely 75% will be Chinese, but they're also minority sort of races, Malay households as well as Indian households in Singapore. So in that sense, the relationships between employers and the domestic workers, as well as broader host society and the migrant workers, tend to sometimes be, the discourse tends to be highly racialized. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are stereotypes as to which kinds of domestic workers are good for what kind of work. For example, I don't like repeating these kinds of stereotypes, but the Filipinos are seen to be a bit too streetwise. I mean, they know how to get their own way, so very hard to, in a sense, control them. Indonesians used to be thought to be a bit slower in terms of performing housework and so forth until the Burmese workers came along, and then now the Burmese workers are seen to be, in a sense, not so quick as, say, the Filipino workers. So there are these kinds of stereotypes that tends to be applied. And what used to be the case, I think is increasingly less so now, is that it is then reflected in the wages that they earn. So Filipinos tend to be paid higher wages than Indonesian domestic workers and Burmese domestic workers. But things are changing very rapidly now, even as we speak, partly because Singapore is not the only country that is, in a sense, recruiting domestic workers. There's now quite a lot of many other countries trying to recruit domestic workers. So it then means that it's no longer driven entirely by demand. Yeah.
Is there just one really quick one? Is there a particular reason why you call it racialized rather than national or ethnic stereotypes?
I suppose, I mean, I could easily sort of use those other words, except to say that race is a word that's very commonly used in Singapore. So, I mean, in that sense, I would, in a sense, want to use the word race because that's clearly what the state uses and what, in a sense, whole society uses as well. Yeah. But you're right that it's, of course, not just race, it's conflated with all the other categories as well.
Next question. I think we have maybe time for one or squeeze in a second question. In class. Oh, really?
Quick question. Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Really enjoyed hearing you speak today. I guess one of the questions that keeps going on in my mind is how to conceptualize love and affection and all of those emotional states in these relationships. I wonder if you could reflect a little on how that fits in with your thinking.
I guess, this is most difficult, not so much with the foreign domestic workers, because they largely work on issues of care, and of course care has many aspects to it, not just physical, but emotional, relational, and so forth, and care ethics and so forth. But the question of love and romance comes in most pertinently in the case of cross-border marriages, because we all have sort of romantic notions of what marriage is about. And then so for me, it's also a cultural shock when we interview inside of women who, the talk I gave yesterday was about Vietnamese women who marry Singaporean men through commercial matchmaking. So they would, in a sense, see their marriage migration as founded on the need to care. They would use the word very much care for their families back home. They would use the word care when talking about the marital family that they are thinking about, that they would want to be cared for and they would want to be a caring member of that family. They will not use the word love. So or very, very sort of, So in that sense, I tend not to use that phrase, in the work, because I don't hear it that much on the ground from the participants of the research. Yeah, but I'm sure that's the other conflation is, of course, love and money. Because which is so I hear sort of mothers, these long distance mothers who have now left their children back home, in sense talking about care for their children in terms of not just affection and so forth, but the fact that they are able to economically provide for better education, for example, for the children. That's a form of care. And for their children, that's based largely on economic as opposed to emotional kind of ties. Yeah.
Carol, just quickly.
Thank you. Sorry. Do you know if there's any work being done on the impact on the mother-child bonding, particularly from the child's reference point, with regard to these 2-year contracts?
Yeah. That is, I think, a very interesting aspect. So, as I was saying yesterday, we are hoping to apply for a grant to look at the children of cross-border marriages, so that the aspect of care. Where it comes to the left-behind children of these migrant mothers and what's happening to them, I think I hope to be able to answer the question a bit more maybe in a couple of years, because we did a project about 8 years ago called CHAMC1, Children and Left Behind, Children and Migrant Parents in Southeast Asia, basically looking at the children who are aged 3 to 5 and 9 to 11. That was 8 years ago. So we managed finally to get a grant. You know how hard it is to get these kinds of grants. To return to the field to look at what's happened to the families that we interviewed 8 years ago, and particularly we focus on what's happened to the children. Right? When they were 3 to 5 and 9 to 11, they drew those kinds of pictures of what the family looked like. So now that they are teenagers, first of all, whether the families are still intact would be one, whether the families have become migrants because we interviewed both migrant and non-migrant households, and in a sense, whether the children, the usual aspirations is to put the children into better schools. I mean, whether that has happened, and the general sorts of aspirations of the children would be something that we would want to investigate. So the short answer is that don't know how to answer that question now. Hope to find out down the road. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, shall we thank Professor Brenda Yeoh?
Thank you. I look forward to hearing.